Chapter 16 Land Use Policy 1. Introduction. This chapter explores the effects of two types of local land use policies. Zoning plans. Development limits. These land use policies are motivated by environmental and fiscal concerns, and have important effects on the prices of land and housing. 1. Zoning plans. A land use zoning plan determines where different types of economic activity, industrial, commercial, and residential, are located within a city. 2. Development limits. A city can limit residential development by I. Restricting the number of building permits, II. Imposing taxes on new housing, and III. Confining development to specific geographic areas. 2. Zoning, history and legal basis, 1 of 2. Zoning is a policy under which a municipality divides land within its borders into separate zones for different types of economic activity. Local governments derive their power to control land use from the states. In most states, the enabling legislation for land use policy is patterned after the Standard State Zoning Enabling Act, developed by the U.S. Department of Commerce in 1926. In most states, the enabling legislation for land use policy is patterned after the Standard State Zoning Enabling Act, which was developed by the U.S. Department of Commerce in 1926 and includes the following language. Grant of power. For the purpose of promoting health, safety, morals, or the general welfare of the community, the legislative body of cities and incorporated villages is hereby empowered to regulate and restrict the height, number of stories, and size of buildings and other structures, the percentage of the lot that may be occupied, the size of yards, courts, and other open spaces, the density of population, and the location and use of buildings, structures, and land for trade, industry, residence, or other purposes. 3. Zoning, history and legal basis, 2 of 2. Zoning is considered a legitimate exercise of the police power of local government if it promotes public health, safety, welfare. In the typical city, land uses are classified into several general classes. Each class is divided into subclasses that vary in density and land use intensity. 4. Zoning classification, Portland, Oregon. Alt text. A table shows zoning classifications in Portland, Oregon. The table shows the following 5 column headers: classification, criterion, residential, single dwelling and minimum lot size, square feet, residential, multiple dwelling and maximum dwellings per acre, commercial and function, employment and industrial and function. Row entries are as follows. Row 1, subclass, 20,000, 15, neighborhood retail and services, general employment. Row 2, subclass, 10,000, 43, regional retail and services, central, industrial and service. Row 3, subclass, 7,000, 65, regional retail and services, general industrial. Row 4, subclass, 5,000, 85 plus, downtown, small and medium office clusters, heavy industrial. Row 5, subclass, small and medium office clusters, heavy industrial. Row 6, subclass, mixed commercial and residential. The table shows the zoning classification system of Portland, Oregon. There are 2 residential classes, for single and multiple dwellings, a commercial class, retail, services, offices, and an industrial class. The residential subclasses are based on lot size and density. The commercial subclasses are based on function. The industrial subclasses are based on location and the level of objectionable impacts such as noise, air pollution, and traffic. 5. A brief history of zoning in the United States. Fischel, 2004, summarizes the history of land use zoning in the United States. Before comprehensive zoning, many cities used ordinances to control land use in specific areas. For example, to address concerns that skyscrapers would block views and light, cities regulated tall buildings. New York City implemented the first comprehensive zoning plan in 1916, 8 other cities followed suit. By 1936, zoning had spread to more than 1,300 cities. Discuss why zoning did not develop earlier. Innovations in transportation increased the location options for business, setting the stage for industrial zoning. Before the intracity truck, the externalities generated by industry and commerce, pollution, noise, congestion, were confined to the central areas of the city, far from the homes of suburban homeowners. The intracity truck, which dates to 1910, allowed firms to move away from the city's central export node and closer to their suburban workers. Once firms became more footloose, cities implemented zoning to separate industry from homes. A headline from the New York Times in 1916 read, "Zoning Act removes fear of business invasion." Innovations in mass transit increased the location options for workers, setting the stage for residential zoning. The motorized passenger bus, developed in 1920, allowed low-income workers to live between the spokes of the streetcar systems, where homeowners had been insulated from high-density housing. Cities developed residential zoning to keep apartments out of homeowner neighborhoods. In the leading case on the constitutionality of zoning, Euclid v. Ambler, 1924, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Sutherland wrote that apartments are a mere parasite, constructed in order to take advantage of the open spaces and attractive surroundings created by the residential character of the district. 6. The legal basis for zoning. Current zoning laws are the result of decades of legal decisions. The courts have established 3 criteria for the constitutionality of zoning. Substantive due process. Equal protection. Just compensation. 1. Substantive due process. Zoning must be executed for a legitimate public purpose using reasonable means. In Euclid v. Ambler, 1924, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that a zoning ordinance that excluded industrial activity from a residential zone satisfied the standards for substantive due process because it had some reasonable relation to the promotion of health, safety, morals, and general welfare. The court did not say that the benefit of zoning must exceed its cost, only that the benefit must be positive. Fischel, 1985, calls this benefit analysis, as opposed to benefit cost analysis. The court defined the possible social benefits from zoning in broad terms, to include monetary, physical, spiritual, and aesthetic benefits. 2. Equal protection. The Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution requires that all laws be applied in an impersonal, non-discriminatory fashion. Zoning is exclusionary in the sense that it excludes some types of people from a municipality, for example, people who live in apartments instead of single-family dwellings. Federal courts have upheld the constitutionality of exclusionary zoning, finding in various cases that, the effects of zoning on people outside the municipality, outsiders, are unimportant. Euclid v. Ambler, 1924, zoning did not cause specific personal damage. Worth v. Selden, 1975, zoning did not arise from discriminatory intent on the part of zoning officials. Village of Arlington Heights v. Metropolitan Housing Corporation, 1977, and IV. Zoning laws that discriminate on the basis of race are unconstitutional, but zoning laws that discriminate on the basis of income are legal. Ibarra v. Town of Los Altos Hills, 1974. In general, the federal courts have adopted a non-interventionist approach to exclusionary zoning. In contrast, some state courts have directed local zoning authorities to accommodate their fair share of low-income residents. 3. Just compensation. The Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution states, "Nor shall private property be taken for public use, without just compensation." This is known as the taking clause. If the government converts land from private to public use, the landowner must be compensated. Most zoning ordinances do not actually convert land to public use, but merely restrict private use and thus decrease its market value. According to Fischel, 1985, the courts have provided mixed and confusing signals to local zoning authorities. The courts routinely uphold zoning laws that cause large losses in property values. Under the harm prevention rule, compensation is not required if the zoning ordinance prevents a harmful use of the land. In other words, zoning is not a taking if it prevents the landowner from using land in ways that are detrimental to the general public. 7. The role of zoning. Zoning in an urban land market fulfills three roles. First, zoning can serve as environmental policy, separating the generators of environmental externalities, commercial and industrial uses, from residents. Second, fiscal zoning can address a fiscal problem by excluding households whose tax payments would be less than the cost of providing local services to them. Third, zoning can mitigate the inefficiencies that result from the combination of density externalities and the free rider problem. 8. Zoning to mitigate environmental externalities, one of two. Zoning is appealing as an environmental policy because it is simple. The easiest way to reduce exposure to pollution is to put a buffer between a polluter and the potential victims. Zoning as an environmental policy doesn't reduce pollution to its socially efficient level, but simply moves it around. An economic approach to pollution is to impose a tax equal to the marginal external cost of pollution, efficiently reducing pollution. A firm subject to a pollution tax pays for pollution in the same way that it pays for raw materials, capital, and labor. The pollution tax gives a firm the incentive to economize on pollution in the same way that it economizes on other inputs to the production process. Zoning can be used to reduce exposure to pollution. Industrial firms generate all sorts of externalities, including noise, glare, dust, odor, vibration, and smoke. 9. Zoning to mitigate environmental externalities, two of two. One approach to urban environmental policy is to combine pollution taxes with zoning. If a city places polluters in industrial zones and imposes a pollution tax, pollution will be reduced to the socially efficient level at the same time that exposure is controlled. Retailers generate a number of externalities that affect nearby residents. A traditional zoning plan deals with these externalities by confining retailers to special zones. Discuss how performance zoning is a more flexible approach than a traditional zoning plan. 10. Zoning to prevent fiscal deficits, one of three. Another role for zoning is to exclude any land user that would not pay enough in taxes to cover the cost of providing local public goods. Local governments raise roughly 3/4 of their tax revenue from property taxes, so a household's local tax liability is determined largely by the value of its house or apartment. A household's use of local public services such as education, recreation, and public safety depends in part on the number of people in the household. A large household in a small dwelling is more likely to generate a fiscal deficit for the local government. 11. Zoning to prevent fiscal deficits and surpluses. Alt text. A bar graph plots fiscal deficits and surpluses in mixed and homogeneous municipalities. The horizontal axis shows house value in $1,000. The vertical axis shows tax rate, listing 1.5, 2, and 3. Each type of municipality has two rectangles of different dimensions. The house value corresponds to the width of the rectangle, the tax rate corresponds to the height of the rectangle, and the tax value corresponds to the area of the rectangle. In a mixed municipality, the house value of the first rectangle is 100, the tax rate is 2, and the tax value is $2,000. The house value of the second rectangle is 200, the tax rate is 2, and the tax value is $4,000. In homogeneous municipalities, the house value of the first rectangle is 100, the tax rate is 3, and the tax value is $3,000. The house value of the second rectangle is 200, the tax rate is 1.5, and the tax value is $3,000. Consider a metropolitan area with a single municipality. The per household cost of public services is $3,000 per year, and there are two types of households: half-owned $100,000 houses, type L for low value, and half-owned $200,000 houses, type H for high value. Local public goods are financed with a property tax. In the figure, house value is on the horizontal axis, and the tax rate is on the vertical axis. The rectangles show the tax liabilities of the two types of houses. As shown by the left pair of rectangles, a tax rate of 2% generates an average of $3,000 per household, with $2,000 from type L, 0.02 times $100,000, and $4,000 from type H, 0.02 times $200,000. In this case, each L household generates a fiscal deficit of $1,000, which is offset by a $1,000 fiscal surplus from each H household. The owners of the more expensive houses have an incentive to exclude the owners of less expensive houses. Suppose type H owners establish an exclusive municipality with a minimum house value of $200,000. In the right side of the figure, the new municipality has a tax rate of only 1.5%, which is just high enough to cover the cost of providing local public goods. In contrast, the type L owners are now forced to pay the full cost of local public goods, and their tax rate increases to 3%. The general lesson is that differences in house values generate incentive for citizens in expensive, high-tax houses to exclude citizens in inexpensive, low-tax houses. 12. Zoning to prevent fiscal deficits, 2 of 3. One way to decrease the likelihood of fiscal deficits is to zone for minimum lot sizes. Housing and land are complementary goods, and in general the larger the lot, the higher the market value of the property, dwelling and land combined. A local government can use a minimum lot size to exclude households that would generate fiscal deficits. To compute the fiscally motivated minimum lot size, a local government computes the break-even value house value V prime. For a house with value V prime, the property tax paid equals the cost of providing public services to the household. 13. Zoning to prevent fiscal deficits, 3 of 3. The local government also computes the price of land R. Using the rough rule of thumb that the market value of a property, for land and dwelling, is about 5 times the value of land, the minimum lot size is. For example, if V prime equals $200,000 and R equals $240,000 per acre, the target lot size is 1/6 acre. Alt text. Formula 1, lot size equals 1/5 space fraction numerator V apostrophe over denominator R end fraction. Formula 2, lot size equals 1/5 space fraction numerator V apostrophe over denominator R end fraction equals 1/5 space fraction numerator $250,000 over denominator $240,000 end fraction equals 1/6. 14. Zoning to mitigate density externalities, 1 of 3. The separation of residential uses by density can mitigate the externalities from high-density housing. Apartment and condominium complexes increase road traffic, causing noise, congestion, and parking problems. Large buildings may disrupt a spacious and green residential atmosphere, and tall buildings may block views and sunlight. Discuss whether separating high-density housing from low-density housing is an ideal response to mitigating density externalities. 15. Zoning to mitigate density externalities, 2 of 3. Under some circumstances, zoning can improve the efficiency of land markets. Consider a city in which everyone prefers to live in neighborhoods with low density rather than high density. Suppose there is a vacant lot in a low-density neighborhood. A firm that would build a large apartment complex is willing to pay $300,000 for the lot, while a firm that would build a single house is willing to pay $100,000 for the lot. 16. Zoning to mitigate density externalities, 3 of 3. In other words, the market outcome is an apartment complex. Suppose each of the 101 existing residents is willing to pay $2,000 to preserve the low-density neighborhood. The socially efficient outcome is the house rather than the apartment complex. The willingness to pay for the house is $302,000, equal to $100,000 from the builder plus $202,000 from neighbors, compared to $300,000 from the apartment builder. In this example, the market outcome is inefficient. Discuss whether a neighborhood association could outbid the apartment builder by collecting $202,000 from affected neighbors. In this example, zoning for moderate density can promote efficient land use. Given the density externality, high density imposes costs on neighbors, and the free rider problem, the banning of the apartment complex allocates the vacant lot to its highest and best use, broadly defined to include the implications of its use on neighboring properties. This is another example of a market failure caused by externalities that could be addressed with public policy. Of course, zoning is a blunt policy instrument for dealing with the combination of density externalities and free riders, and it's easy to imagine circumstances in which residential zoning generates inefficient land use. For example, suppose the willingness to pay for preserving moderate density is only $500 per neighbor. In this case, the aggregate willingness to pay for the house is only $150,500, equal to $100,000 from the builder plus $50,500 from neighbors, compared to $300,000 from the apartment builder. In this case, the market equilibrium, the apartment complex, is efficient. Nonetheless, each neighbor has an incentive to voice support for banning the apartment complex, and voice matters in zoning policy. If the collective voice in opposition to high density is loud enough, the city may make an inefficient choice, using residential zoning to ban the efficient apartment complex. 17. The market effects of low-density zoning. Does the gap in the willingness to pay between two users mean that the land market is inefficient? Alt text, 2 line graphs plot decrease in demand for land for houses and apartments. In the first graph, the horizontal axis shows area of land for houses in hectares, listing 40 and 50. The vertical axis shows cost in dollars, listing our prime and our asterisk. The line for demand falls through point A, 40, our asterisk, and point B, 50, our prime. In the second graph, the horizontal axis shows area of land for apartments in hectares, listing 20 and 30. The vertical axis shows cost in dollars, listing our asterisk and our double prime. The line for demand falls through point D, 20, our double prime, and point C, 30, our asterisk. The figure illustrates the market effects of zoning in favor of low-density housing. In the market equilibrium shown by point A and point C, land is allocated to the highest bidder, and the equilibrium price is the same, our asterisk, in both markets. At the equilibrium price, 40 hectares of land are allocated to houses and 30 hectares are allocated to apartments. Suppose the city zones 50 hectares for low-density houses, leaving 20 hectares for high-density apartments. In the figure, the market goes to point B in the house market and to point D in the apartment market. The increase in the supply of land zoned for houses decreases the price from our asterisk to our prime, while the decrease in the supply of land zoned for apartments increases the price from our asterisk to our double prime. The price gap means that an apartment builder is willing to pay more for a vacant lot than a house builder. Our double prime is greater than our prime. Does the gap in the willingness to pay between the two land users mean that the land market is inefficient? Recall that if there are density externalities, we must incorporate neighbors' willingness to pay for low density into the efficiency analysis. If the neighbors of a vacant lot are collectively willing to pay at least R double prime minus R prime to prevent high-density housing, the zoning outcome is efficient in the sense that land is allocated to the highest and best use, broadly defined to include external effects. In contrast, if density externalities are small relative to the gap between the willingness to pay by apartment builders and house builders, R double prime minus R prime, zoning generates an inefficient outcome. 18. Limits on residential development. We turn next to the effects of local government policies that restrict residential development. The simplest policy is to limit the number of building permits issued. Alternatively, a local government can impose taxes on new housing. A third approach is to specify geographical limits to development by establishing green belts or urban growth boundaries. In this part of the chapter, we consider the partial equilibrium effects of these policies, focusing on implications for the prices of housing and residential land. In the next part of the chapter, we extend the policy analysis to consider the implications for the urban labor market and the market for commercial land. What is the rationale for a limit on residential development? In some cases, a limit is a response to a fiscal problem. Because of imperfections in the local tax system, new development may impose a fiscal burden. The additional cost of providing local public goods may exceed the additional tax payments. As we'll see, a limit on residential development increases the market price of existing housing, providing another possible motive. 19. Limits on building permits. The market effects of a limit on building permits. What is the monetary value of a building permit? Alt text, a line graph plots supply and MC, demand, supply for 100 permits, and WTP for permits. The horizontal axis shows new houses per year, listing 100 and 160. The vertical axis shows cost in $1,000, listing 120, 170, 200, and 260. The WTP for permits is the difference between Y equals 260 and Y equals 170. The line for demand falls from maximum cost through point B, 100, 260, and point A, 160, 200. The line for supply and MC rises through 0, 120, point C, 100, 170, and point A, 160, 200. The line for supply for 100 permits is vertical, rising through point C, 100, 170, and point B, 100, 260. Some cities limit residential development by restricting the number of building permits. A restriction could be direct, in the form of an explicit maximum number of permits per year, or could be indirect, in the form of a costly and time-consuming review process that discourages builders from applying for a permit. The figure shows the market effects of a direct policy under which a city issues a maximum of 100 permits per year. Initial equilibrium. The demand curve intersects the supply curve, marginal cost curve, at point A, generating an equilibrium price of $200,000 and an equilibrium quantity of 160. Limit on building permits. The supply curve is kinked and goes vertical at the number of permits, 100. The new supply curve intersects the market demand curve at point B, so the price of housing increases to $260,000. In other words, housing consumers bear part of the cost of the permit policy, paying an additional $30,000 for a house. The permit policy also decreases the marginal cost of producing housing. As explained in a microeconomics course, a supply curve is also a marginal cost curve. In the case of housing, the supply, marginal cost, curve is positively sloped because an increase in the quantity of housing produced increases the demand for land, increasing its price. At the market equilibrium quantity of 160 houses, the marginal cost of housing is $200,000, point on the supply and marginal cost curve, which includes the price of the lot on which the house is built. The permit policy decreases the quantity of housing produced to 100 houses, decreasing the demand for land and its price. As shown by point C, the new marginal cost of housing is only $170,000, indicating that the lot price has decreased by $30,000, equal to $200,000 minus $170,000. In other words, landowners bear part of the cost of the building permit policy. What is the monetary value of a building permit? A permit holder can build a new house at a cost of $170,000, point C, and sell it at the new market price of $260,000, point B, generating a surplus of $90,000. This is the maximum willingness to pay for a permit. A city that auctions 100 permits to the highest bidders could raise $9 million per year. Alternatively, the city could accept proposals from developers and allocate the permits to the most appealing projects. In this case, a builder has an incentive to invest resources in plans and presentations to convince the city that his or her proposal merits approval. This is an example of rent-seeking, defined as investing resources in the pursuit of favorable treatment by the public sector. Rent-seeking is wasteful in the sense that the resources used for persuasion could instead be used in other ways. 20. Development taxes. Market effects of a development tax. Why does the builder shift 2/5 of the tax backward onto the landowners? Alt text, a line graph plots demand, supply and MC, and supply in the presence of $20,000 tax. The horizontal axis shows new houses per year, listing H double asterisk and H asterisk. The vertical axis shows cost in $1,000, listing 192, 200, and 212. The line for demand falls through point D, H double asterisk, 212, and point B, H asterisk, 200. The line for supply and MC rises through point C, H double asterisk, 192, and point B, H asterisk, 200. The line for supply in the presence of a $20,000 tax shifts upward by $20 from the previous line, rising through point D, H double asterisk, 212. A residential development tax is imposed at the time a dwelling is built, and is paid in legal terms by the builder. In the figure, the initial, pre-tax equilibrium is shown by point B, with price equals $200,000 and a quantity equals H asterisk new houses per year. A development tax shifts the supply curve for new housing upward by the amount of the tax, $20,000, and increases the equilibrium price to $212,000, shown by point D. In other words, the builder shifts 3/5 of the tax, $12,000/$20,000, forward to housing consumers. The builder shifts the remainder of the tax backward onto landowners. The development tax decreases the number of houses built, decreasing the demand for land and its price. In the figure, the marginal cost of housing decreases from $200,000, point B, to $192,000, point C, reflecting an $8,000 decrease in the cost of a plot of land for a new house. In other words, the builder shifts 2/5 of the tax, $8,000/$20,000, backward onto landowners. Some cities impose development taxes to cover the additional cost of providing local public goods to new residential areas. For example, revenue from development taxes could be used to build infrastructure, roads, sewers, schools, and parks, to serve new residential areas. These sorts of development taxes are labeled impact fees or system development charges. 21. Growth boundary and the housing market. Discuss how the increase in price from the growth boundary is beneficial for some people and costly for others. Alt text, a line graph plots demand, supply and MC, and supply in the presence of a growth boundary. The horizontal axis shows new houses per year, listing H prime, H double asterisk, and H asterisk. The vertical axis shows cost in dollars, listing P** and P**. Point C corresponds to H' and low cost. The line for demand falls through point D, H**, P***, and point B, H**, P***. The line for supply and MC rises through point C and point B, H**, P***. The line for supply in the presence of a growth boundary rises through point C and point D, H**, P***. Some cities limit residential development by confining development to specific geographical areas. The confinement policy could be an explicit ban on development outside a defined development area. Alternatively, a city could block the provision of vital public goods in certain areas. In both cases, residential development is confined within an urban growth boundary. The figure shows the effects of a growth boundary on the urban housing market. The initial market equilibrium is shown by point B. The growth boundary generates a kink in the supply curve at point C. For relatively small quantities of housing, less than H', the growth boundary is irrelevant, so the supply curve is unaffected by the policy. The boundary becomes relevant at H' dwellings, and its negative effect on housing supply increases as the potential market expands. The growth boundary increases the equilibrium price of housing from P** to P*** and decreases the equilibrium quantity from H** to H**. The increase in price from the growth boundary is beneficial for some people and costly for others. A person who owns housing at the time the growth boundary is announced gets a capital gain equal to P** minus P***. In contrast, a newcomer to the housing market in the city pays a higher housing price. 22. Growth boundary and the land market. Compare the growth boundary policy with other policies that limit residential development, building permits, and development taxes. Alt text: a line graph plots urban bid rent with boundary, and agricultural bid rent. The horizontal axis shows kilometers from center, listing 8 and 12. The vertical axis shows cost in dollars. The boundary is a vertical line at x equals 8. Point S corresponds to value 12 and low cost, point B corresponds to value 8 and low cost, and point C corresponds to value 8 and moderate cost. The curve for urban bid rent falls from high cost through point A. The curve for urban bid rent with boundary falls from very high cost toward point C. The line for agricultural bid rent is horizontal, passing through points B and A. The figure shows the implications of a growth boundary for the urban land market. Consider a metropolitan area that is initially expected to expand to a circle with a radius of 12 miles. In other words, the initial urban land bid curve intersects the agricultural bid curve at a distance of 12 miles from the city center. Suppose a new growth boundary is 8 miles from the city center. For land between 8 and 12 miles from the center, the price drops to the agricultural bid, shown by the segment of the horizontal line between point A and point B. The households displaced by the growth boundary will bid up the price of land within the boundary. This is shown by the upward shift of the urban bid curve from the city center to a distance of 8 miles. In other words, landowners within the boundary gain at the expense of landowners outside the boundary. How does the growth boundary policy compare to the other policies that limit residential development, that is, building permits and development taxes? All three policies increase the price and decrease the quantity of housing. The difference occurs in the land market. Building permits and development taxes decrease land prices. In contrast, a growth boundary produces winners and losers among landowners. There are benefits for landowners with favorable geography, inside the boundary, and costs for landowners with unfavorable geography, outside the boundary. 23. The market effects of land use regulations. The Wharton Regulatory Index measures the stringency of land use regulations. The index has a value of 0 for the average city, a positive value for cities with above-average stringency, and a negative value for cities with below-average stringency. Among the factors that increase the value of the index are a lengthy review process for building projects, development taxes, requirements that builders provide open space, large minimum lot sizes. 24. The regulatory housing price premium. Alt text. A table shows the regulatory housing price premium. The table shows 3 column headers: city, municipality, regulation index, housing price premium in dollars. Row entries are as follows. Row 1, Atlanta, 0.70, 89,606. Row 2, Chicago, 1.15, minus 147,209. Row 3, Dallas, minus 0.14, minus 17,921. Row 4, San Francisco, 1.96, 250,896. Row 5, Seattle, 2.39, 305,939. The table shows the values of the Wharton Index and the implications for housing prices in several municipalities. The regulatory price premium is computed as the difference in the price of housing, relative to the national average, that is attributable to the regulatory environment. In Chicago, a below-average stringency generates a price of housing that is $147,209 below the average. At the other extreme, Seattle's highly stringent environment generates a premium of $305,939. A household that moves from a house in Chicago to an otherwise identical house in Seattle would pay an additional $453,248. 25. Regulatory housing price premium metropolitan. Alt text. A bar graph shows that the regulatory housing premium in Atlanta is $5,120, Boston is $197,132, Chicago is $7,680, Dallas is negative $44,803, San Francisco is $115,207, and Seattle is $129,288. The figure shows the regulatory premiums at the metropolitan level. The typical large metropolitan area has a large number of municipalities, each with its own set of residential land use policies. In the figure, the premium for a particular metropolitan area is a weighted average of the premiums of its individual municipalities. The regulation premium ranges from -$44,803 in Dallas to $197,132 in Boston. 26. Growth control and labor markets. In this part of the chapter, we extend the analysis to explore the effects of land use policy on the urban labor market and the market for commercial land. In addition, we look beyond the city to explore the effects of its policies on other cities in the regional economy. Residential limits and the urban economy. The general equilibrium model of the urban economy shows the interactions between urban land markets, for business and residential land, and the urban labor market, supply from the residential area and demand from the business area. We can use the model to show how a policy that limits residential development affects the rest of the urban economy. We will use an urban growth boundary as an example of a policy that limits residential development. 27. General equilibrium effects of a growth boundary. Identify and discuss the key insight developed from this general equilibrium analysis. Alt text. A line graph plots the shift in business and residential bid curves. The horizontal axis shows kilometers from center, listing X subscript 4, X subscript 1, X subscript 3, and X subscript 2. The vertical axis shows cost in dollars. Point C corresponds to X subscript 4 and high cost, point A corresponds to X subscript 1 and moderate cost, point D corresponds to X subscript 3 and moderate cost, and point B corresponds to X subscript 2 and low cost. The line for boundary is vertical, with equation x equals x subscript 3. The curve for business falls from maximum cost through point A. This curve shifts downward and falls through point C. The curve for resident falls through points A and B. This curve shifts upward and falls through points C and D. The steepness for the business curves are greater than that of the resident curves. The figure shows the effects of an urban growth boundary on the land and labor markets of a monocentric city. The initial equilibrium is shown by point A and point B, where the initial business bid curve intersects the initial residential bid curve at a distance x1 and the residential curve intersects the horizontal agricultural bid curve at x2. The width of the CBD is x1 and the width of the residential district is x2 minus x1. Total labor demand in the business district equals the total labor supply from the residential district, so we have equilibrium in both the land market and the labor market. A growth boundary at x3 reduces the residential territory, decreasing labor supply. The resulting excess demand for labor increases the wage. The increase in the wage increases production cost and shifts the business bid curve downward, in accordance with the leftover principle. At the same time, the increase in the wage increases the price of housing, shifting the residential bid curve upward. Equilibrium is restored at point C and point D, with a CBD width x4 and a residential width x3 minus x4. 28. Intercity effects of an urban growth boundary. Who will gain from the growth boundary? Alt text. A line graph plots the intercity effects of an urban growth boundary. The horizontal axis shows workers in millions, listing 4, 5, and 6. The vertical axis shows utility, listing U double asterisk, U asterisk, and U prime. All data are approximate. The curve for initial utility rises from moderate utility level and 0.5 million workers, reaches a peak, and falls through point B, 4, U prime, point A, 5, U asterisk, and point C, 6, U double asterisk. The curve for control city rises from low utility level and 0.5 million workers, reaches a peak, and falls toward point D, 4, U double asterisk. We turn next to the effects of one city's growth boundary on other cities in the regional economy. Recall the model of cities in a regional economy, which we developed in an earlier chapter. In our model of a two-city regional economy, the total workforce of the region is fixed, and workers are perfectly mobile between the cities. To simplify matters, we will assume that workers rent residential land from absentee landowners. In the figure, the initial, pre-policy, equilibrium is shown by point A, with 5 million workers in each city, and a common utility level U*. Suppose control city implements a precise growth control policy. The city reduces its workforce from 5 million to 4 million by A, specifying a minimum lot size per worker and B, fixing the total land area of the city. The 1 million workers displaced by growth control in control city move to the other city, increasing its workforce to 6 million. The immediate effect is to increase utility in control city to U prime, point B, and to decrease utility in the other city to U asterisk asterisk, point C. Workers are perfectly mobile between the two cities, so this utility gap will not persist. The utility gap will be eliminated by changes in the land market. The region's workers compete for a fixed number of lots in control city, and workers will bid up land rent in control city. An increase in land rent decreases worker utility, and rent will continue to increase until the utility gap is eliminated. In the figure, the increase in land rent shifts the utility curve downward. Given the maximum of 4 million workers in control city, the other city has a workforce of 6 million and a utility level of U asterisk asterisk, point C. In other words, the common, region-wide, utility level is anchored by point C. Therefore, land rent in control city must rise to the point at which utility decreases to the utility anchor, U asterisk asterisk. This is shown by point D on the lower utility curve for control city. In the new regional equilibrium, workers are indifferent between the two cities. The benefits of living in a smaller city, Control City, are fully offset by higher land rent and the resulting higher cost of living. 29.